Right, so my name is Roger Yates. I've been a vegan since 1979, so I'm just on 40 years now. I was involved in England in lots of the grassroots movement there, including Sea Shepherd. We did an event in the Orkney Islands, Save the Seals type thing. I was the press officer for the Animal Liberation Front, or more technically, the Animal Liberation Front Supporters Group. And I was involved in the first ALF show trial, I guess it was called, so I ended up with 4 years in prison. So that's the kind of activist part. In terms of academia, my MA was about the British movement, and I called it a sociology of compromise. And the PhD was on the support pillars of cultural speciesism, which are theology and everyday social practice and philosophy. And then I'm at the moment involved with this group, the VIP, which is a public education group essentially based in Dublin. Okay, so this talk I've given to a few places, and get the technology to work, here we go. Essentially, this might sound a bit weird, but the talk is designed to introduce vegans to their own movement, okay? And the reason for that is that the vision of the pioneers of our movement was very radical. They were kind of real revolutionaries. Now, in a sense, there's a weirdness to that, in the sense that they were kind of gentle English folk. They didn't speak in the kind of polemicy terms that we are used to nowadays. They didn't speak in sound bites. But what they had to say and what they stood for was very radical. What concerns me at present is that some of that radicalism has been lost in terms of there are efforts to redefine what veganism is all about. So there are some people who want to redefine veganism as just a diet, which it never was. And there are also some people who want to define it as just about other animals and nothing to do with humans, which it never was. Okay, so I want to kind of try to recapture and spread, if you like, the vision of the original social movement founders. So we're talking about the people who came together in the 1940s in Britain. Now, these weren't the first vegans, of course, but they were the first people to put together a social movement for veganism, and then they came up with the term vegan. And this is a basic definition of what a social movement is all about. So it's an organised effort to bring about change or to resist change. Now, this is very important in terms of what academics call the movement, social movement, and the movement, counter-movement dialectic, which basically means that one movement opposes another. And the classic example would be pro-life and pro-choice in that sense. So some movements are to create change, other movements are to resist that change. And in terms of veganism, the idea of the vegan social movement was to create a very large change in society indeed. Now, this is a definition from 1945, and it's more of a statement, really. I tend to think this is better than the definition of veganism that people are familiar with, which is the one about practical and all that kind of stuff. The object of the vegan society is to oppose the exploitation of sentient life, whether it's profitable to do so or not. And the important part is it was all of sentient life. So again, the radical vision of the pioneers is kind of outlined. This is, I'm going to show you two slides from Matthew Cole, who's a sociologist, a friend of mine. And he talks about the breathtaking scope of the early pioneers. But this is the bit that I want to pick out, which is from Watson, Donald Watson, one of the co-founders of the Vegan Society. And he's basically kind of really making a plea here for us as vegans to know the history of our movement. Now, this again is an odd thing for me, because if I joined a movement, as I did in the 1970s, I started to learn about it. There is a phenomenon now where you've got a lot of new vegans, a new generation of vegans, who are entering the vegan social movement and kind of making it up as they go along, without any reference to the founders of their own movement. I personally think that's wrong and actually unfair, and so this is why I do this talk. I've said to people, well, you know, if you believe that veganism is only about other animals and nothing to do with humans, as a lot of people would argue nowadays, I said, so long as you understand that you're out of step with the founders of the movement. And the response I've often got is, F the founders. You know, we are the kind of new generation, and we don't care about what they stood for. I tend to think that that is an unfair thing to do, because I think that people who join a social movement should at least be aware of what the founders stood for, even if they want to move it on. Because I've always argued that the views of the founders are not law, they're not set in stone, so they can change. It's just that we ought to at least allow for the fact that we did have a set of founders, and that means that we had a set of founding principles and values, and we have a philosophy. Veganism is a philosophy and not a diet. So this is the vegan social movement. It was founded in 1944 in England, of course. So that meant it was founded during World War II, a global conflict. And that had a big effect on the pioneers. Essentially, they were trying to work out what had happened to humanity. We'd had two global conflicts in very short order, and they wanted to find out what was going on. And they generally thought that veganism was part of the solution to this issue. And you'll see this in all the quotes and everything that I'm going to show you in a minute. But essentially, you can sum it up by saying that they saw themselves as part of the peace movement. Donald Watson famously was a conscientious objector. They saw veganism as about justice, and they saw it being about non-violence or less violence, if you like. And I tend to sum it up as being about justice for all, and again, all sentient beings. And then this part is really quite interesting, I think. A few of the founders repeat this theme over and over, particularly Leslie Cross, which is that veganism is part of the moral evolution of humanity. And essentially, they thought that veganism as a social movement and its values could reclaim what they thought had been lost. They essentially thought that human beings had kind of gone back, regressed into some kind of savage state, which led to the rise of Nazism, Third Reich, world wars, concentration camps. They were trying to work out, how could we have got so violent? And they thought, generally thought, that veganism was part of the solution. And I think that's a valuable thing to think about. You could think it utopian, but there's nothing wrong with a bit of utopian vision within the social movement anyway. But I think it's something that we should not lose track of, personally. And the final thing I want to say is about language. Most people, and I take it probably most people here are students, so you'll know that people are a product of their time, including academics. So you'll see that they express themselves within the values of the time that they were writing in the 1940s and 1950s. So they would talk about humanity as being man, or men, meaning humanity, that kind of thing, right? So it became that sexist language of the time, if you like. So we've got to kind of allow them for that. The history of the movement is white and rather male, except that it wasn't, well, it was white, but it wasn't totally male. The female voices, as always with lots of things, tend to get kind of squashed down. So here are some of the founders who played a very important role in the beginning of the vegan social movement. Elsley Shrigley there, also known as Sally. This is Dorothy Watson with Donald. You can work out which one is which. And although, of course, in our trans times, we might not be able to do that. But Watson is always credited with coining the word vegan, right? And he famously took the first 3 letters of vegetarian, the last 3 of vegetarian and vegan. And so there's now a meme going around, you've probably seen it, cut out the crap in the middle, right, and go vegan. Right? So he's kind of credited with coining that term. But there is some evidence that Elsie did that, and Dot may have done it as well, you know. But again, the kind of, if you like, the female influence in the movement is more silenced, and we know more about the men. This is a kind of common theme in lots of social movements. Kathleen Janaway is a very interesting person. She kind of split from the Vegan Society, and she started something called Movement for Compassionate Living, which is a kind of like an anarchic group. And they have a vision of the future based on autonomous, tree-based villages. Yeah. It's not kind of really going back to primitivism or anything like that. It's more to do with the fact that they kind of rejected capitalism, and they actually had a future which didn't involve money. It was to do with like bartering, this kind of thing. So that was quite an interesting one. And then finally, Eva Batt. Eva Batt is most famous in the vegan movement for writing what may be the first vegan cookbook, which is called What's Cooking, and then there was another one called What Else Is Cooking. But I'm going to come back to Eva Batt and show you a really brilliant quote from her in relation to the wider aspect of the philosophy. Now this is a general summary of what I want to put over today. And this is from 1995, it's by Kath Clements, and veganism is about having a consistent approach to human rights and animal rights, ecology and world food problems. Now, we now call ecology environmentalism, and world food problems are obviously issues of starvation, food security, all those kind of things that vegans still kind of talk about. And we probably know as vegan activists, we often get, you know, people come up and say, you know, why don't you care about humans? And we always have to say, hang on a minute, we do. And one of the ways that humans would benefit from a vegan world would be that there would be enough food for them all. Because we have this weird situation where society in general is more concerned about providing feed than food. So there is a lot of food about, it's just that we prefer to feed other animals. You know, I always talk about 2 kind of population explosions, and I say, okay, say one of them is human, one of them is non-human. Which one is most important? Oh, the human, everyone says. And I say, well, it's interesting though, isn't it? Because that's not how it pans out. Because while something like 14,000 children will die today of starvation-related issues, there'll be no farmed animal who will be hungry tonight. Because we prefer to feed them over the humans. And yet, everybody who challenges vegans in this way, they pay lip service to human rights. It's quite an interesting thing that's going on there. So we're back to Eva Batt. This is 1964. And she wrote a pamphlet for the Vegan Society called Why Veganism? And she says this very strident thing. Veganism is one thing and one thing only, a way of living which avoids exploitation, whether it be of our fellow men, that's the sexist thing, the animal population, or the soil upon which we rely for our very existence. Now some people say, that's an odd idea to exploit the soil, right? What they really was talking about was making sure that the soil remained fertile and fit for purpose, if you like. And in fact, the issue of the quality and even the amount of soil that we've got left available to us came back into the vegan movement via a book in the 1980s by John Robbins called Diet for a New America, where he talked about the depletion of topsoil and the real kind of issue that we might actually be running out of soil which we can grow crops in. And so this, again, was stating that very kind of radical vision that what veganism was about was a means to benefit other animals, humanity, and also the environment, if you want to put it that way in terms of the soil. Now this is a controversial one, because Donald Watson is quoted here, and he's arguing that veganism is the greatest movement of all time, really. The greatest movement that ever was. And he talks about other movements as lesser movements. So you could think this is kind of fairly arrogant, but I think what he was getting at was that veganism acts as some kind of overarching principle which incorporates everything else. That's what I think he was getting at here. And he used this metaphor of the Titanic, that we were trying to do something about the hull and everybody else was rearranging the deck chairs, right? But essentially, he's saying that the vegan vision will save everyone. We're not just picking out, constituent parts of the problem. It's an overarching idea, and veganism was the solution to it. Now, I think, this is before things like second wave feminism and this kind of stuff, but I think that he would have probably incorporated ideas like feminism, anti-racism, that into this kind of idea that veganism encapsulates all of that. And I think, and this is my interpretation here, I think that what he was getting at is in a vegan world, and as you'll see later, they talk about a vegan mindset. In a vegan world, I think what they meant was that, there really should be a non-violence principle. So there should be no domestic violence and rape and racism in a vegan world. So, I still see memes saying, well, you can go vegan, but that doesn't mean you're going to be a nice person. That's not what these people thought. They thought automatically, if you buy into vegan values, you would become a moral person. It would be part and parcel of the kind of kit and caboodle. That would be kind of part of the deal. And that's why, for Watson, veganism was a very big idea, the greatest cause on earth. Now, I'm not going to read all these out, but I'm going to just pick out some bits. A lot of people say that Watson was only concerned about food and health. It's not true. He talked about these kind of things, that veganism would be the greatest peaceful revolution ever known. And again, that theme returns over and over in the better interests of humanity and other animals. This is repeated over and over. This is part of their radical idea. You buy into veganism, the biggest idea about peace and non-violence, and everybody will benefit. And Watson said, this is going to be a massive, peaceful revolution. This is Jack Sanderson. He was the editor of The Vegan. And again, you'll see the same themes. Erase from the face of the earth all the wrong exploitation of the collective life of the earth, that of the creatures and the plants, and that of man. So again, we're seeing this kind of theme being reproduced. That veganism is about justice for everyone, for all. It's not talking, certainly not talking about a diet, but it's not talking about what some of the modern day YouTube people will try and tell you, which is that veganism has got nothing to do with human rights. I've got a video out, and I go back to a clip from somebody and said, let's get this one straight. Veganism is nothing to do with humans. And he goes back to me and I say, sorry, that's wrong. Right? Because it's wrong. In terms of what veganism was set up to do, it was to liberate humanity as well. I'm going to talk about focus and scope in a minute to kind of put this into an interesting context. Now, these are a few quotes from Leslie Cross, who he was a bit more kind of radical maybe, and interesting because some of the definitions of veganism that we know are attributed to Watson, whereas actually Watson didn't really define veganism too well. In fact, Watson was so busy being everything, cook and bottle washer, secretary, everything else, that he was kind of like just too busy running the society. I feel a bit sorry for Don Watson because he went down, co-founded the thing with several people, and they almost like said, okay, Don, it's all yours for a while, right? And it wasn't until about 8 to 10 years later when Leslie Cross said, hang on a second, we better kind of define what veganism is and what it's all about. And again, we'll see the themes of kind of what you might call pro-intersectionality coming through. I think that if the vegan society was formed now, we would call it pro-intersectional. I know that's a controversial thing in the vegan movement, but that's exactly what we would probably call it now. And so he talks about the obvious things. We would liberate other animals, we would not eat them, and all that. And he also talks about vivisection, etc., etc. But he says some of the changes are not so obvious. And those changes are about the vegan mindset and about the idea that humanity would be kindlier, nicer. And this is very important, that veganism would be a great improvement in terms of our health, but that means our physical and our mental health. He actually thought that if we could emancipate other animals, we would be simultaneously, if there's any North American viewers of this, simultaneously, liberating ourselves. He really believed that. That was their vision. That if we really want to get to the bottom of why we've become so violent, we're going to have to kind of go to our roots and think, well, we digest violence 3 times a day. We eat it, we metabolize it, we take it inside. An Irish journalist said to me, are you really serious about this? And I said, well, yeah, if you think about it, there's no way of producing animal product without violence. And we eat it, we take it inside, That can't be good. And that's what they thought. That, it kind of, you take it in, it'll come back out type idea, This is Leslie Cross again, this is 1954, the other one was as well. And again, he's kind of mapping out what veganism is. Until the advent of veganism, comparatively few regarded the animals as being either worthy of or entitled to the right to be free. And probably fewer still realised the impressive effort which the granting of such a right would be on the freedom of humanity itself. So this theme, again, is repeating. There's a couple of things I want to say here. This is long before Tom Reagan. Where's Tom Reagan? That one. So Tom Reagan here. And so Tom... Cheers, Dick. So Tom Reagan wrote The Case for Animal Rights, and it was published in 1983. But he started writing it in the late 70s, or certainly started thinking about it and writing about a few things in the late 70s. So that idea of rights-based animal rights wasn't around at the time when Cross was talking. And by saying that we grant rights is to misread what rights is all about. And the best way to understand rights in an animal rights context is to get a grip of what it means, the difference between positive and negative rights and moral and legal rights. Because when you've got a moral rights case, you're not talking about granting rights. You're talking about whether those rights which exist are respected or not. It's not as though women didn't have rights until some kindly bunch of men came and gave them the right to this and that. It's that those rights were being disrespected until then. Okay, so that's an important point, that we need to understand that rights are not gifts. Yeah, so we don't, the kind of elite or the entitled don't give out rights. Now, that's where the legal and the moral rights come into it, because the legal rights are a little bit like gifts, because they can be granted by parliaments and this kind of thing. Moral rights are pre-legal rights. These are rights that exist as an idea, because let's face it, rights is an idea. I always say it's like the speed limit, right? 30 kilometers an hour doesn't exist in nature, right? But it exists in society, right? And the same is with rights. They don't actually exist in nature, but we can make them exist by socially constructing them. That's the way it works. This is the long one. Now this is where focus and scope comes into it. Because when people object to what I'm saying here, and they're going, well look, you know, humans have got all kinds of movements and the other animals need their own. I say, well, they do have their own. It's called the vegan movement. It's just that that's not all of it. And then they get their definitions out. And this is the problem with definitions. If you try and define a really big revolutionary idea, you've got a problem. It's very difficult. And you'll find that the modern definitions of anything big, and I talk about Marxism or quantum physics or whatever you want to talk about, those definitions now on the internet are full of hyperlinks because it's kind of acknowledged that this idea is so big you can't actually capture it in a definition. So if you're going to have a talk about veganism, we can't just go to the definition and say, ha, this is all of veganism. What we can say is that when somebody says, but isn't it about the other animals? And isn't it about them first? Well, you can go with that because that is the focus of veganism. That's the focus, but not the scope. Okay. So here he talks about these two things. This is all about the focus, and this second bit where he says the second broad aspect is about the scope. So it's very important. And the second broad aspect is again about what it would do for us. It's part of the moral evolution of humanity. And then he's talking about our relationship with other creatures on a relatively equal footing. That's important. And then the pursuit of happiness is foredoomed to a, tragic and painful frustration. We're all doomed. That's probably a cultural reference we won't get from Dad's Army. Relatively equal footing is important, again in rights theory. I hear a lot of people talking as though other animals need or require or have human rights. This is a misreading of the animal rights case. The animal rights case is actually quite modest, and that's based on the idea of negative rights. Negative rights are the ones that protect us. So it's our right to life. Gary Francione, the legal scholar, would say that we only need one right, which is, the right not to be property. People like Tom Reagan would talk about the right to life, bodily integrity, freedom, those kind of things. But these are kind of protective rights. And often these metaphors are used that you can think of a person with a wall or a fence around them. And on that is a no trespass sign. And unless you allow somebody in for, say, sexual purposes or whatever else, they're not allowed in. Because our rights create duties in others. Yeah? But in terms of positive rights, other animals don't really have those. Because they're the kind of human rights, like the right to education, the right to drive, that kind of thing. I kind of expressed this by saying, I did this in my PhD, I said, think of basic rights as our animal rights, the rights that we share with other sentient beings. Right? On top of our basic rights, our animal rights, we build our human rights. So on top of our negative or our basic rights, we build our positive or our non-basic rights, which apply really to us, right, and not the other animals. So animal rights as an idea is actually quite modest. I always say it's a modest idea, but it's got very widespread kind of ramifications. It would mean a lot of changes, obviously, but it's actually quite a modest idea in terms of a philosophical idea. Leslie Cross from 51. This is where he talks about not about welfare, but it's about liberation. So this is a kind of first, if you like, inklings of the kind of rights versus liberation kind of distinction, if you like. And then here he's reaffirming this idea that we've kind of sunk. And he actually uses the phrase, we've got to do something about our lower nature. Yeah. So again, it's a kind of language that we might not use today, but if we can get past this, get past our savage state kind of thing, then the benefits to us will be massive. That's basically what you're saying there. And we're getting close to it now, close to the end. This is Matthew again, and he talks about the aim of veganism. Combines compassionate non-exploitation of other animals with an emancipated vegan self and a more compassionate human society. Vegan ethics from the beginning was directed towards these interconnected goals of transforming human beings and transforming human society, with both flowing from the foundational reconfiguration of human, non-human, and relations. So that is a very kind of concise statement, summary of what I've been saying to you today. That if we can bring about a world full of vegan ethics, then we're going to bring about some very big and some very good changes for everyone, including the other animals.